Hello everybody and welcome to TBR's webinar, The Developer's Coup, 2015 Applications Development Demands and Vendor Opportunities. I'm Justin Sargent and I'll be hosting today's session. The traditional developer-based decision-making process for bringing cloud computing to a business will become a group decision as executive, IT, and line of business teams collaborate more during the process over the next 2 years, according to TBR's Cloud Platform and Developer Report. Platform-driven ecosystems provide vendors more profitable and broader routes to market. Vendors aiming to build a viable partner ecosystems focus on attracting developers to carve out a place in the market ahead of competitors. However, as decision makers expand beyond developers, vendors will need to consider a new set of requirements from a broader group. Insights from our presentation today are from our Cloud Platform and Developer Report. If you'd like to learn more about this report, please reach out to myself or one of the analysts after the presentation. And before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit this channel to watch this presentation or any of the previous webinars we've posted. Second, we welcome questions on the material we're presenting today. Please send any questions you have to the Q&A function, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And finally, I'll be following up with all of you via email with these slides as well as the previously mentioned link for today's recording within 24 hours. So be on the lookout tomorrow afternoon for that in your inbox. Now I'd like to introduce the analyst presenting today. Principal Analyst Allan Krans leads TBR's coverage of the technologies and business models at play across the cloud computing landscape. Allan is the content editor of TBR's Cloud Platform and Developer Report. Jillian Mirandi is a senior analyst in TBR's cloud practice, responsible for analyzing key vendors in the market. Jillian is our lead author on several TBR syndicated reports and benchmarks, including the Cloud Platform and Developer Report, which this presentation is based on today. Now with that, let me hand this over to the analyst.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. My name is Allan Krans, and I'll do the introduction to today's presentation, which really draws from the key research areas that you see laid before you here, all of which are included in much more detail in the developer report, which was published earlier this year. And we're going to be expanding upon that with a broader set of analysis and survey research around developer trends going forward. So the research and what you'll hear today really draws from both coverage of some of the leading development platforms, which are listed on the left-hand side of the slide, in terms of the business models, the value propositions, the types of technology that are provided to developers as part of that overall experience. So as you know, there's a lot of different options out there for developers to choose from and to select from. You know, a big part of today's presentation will be filtering through the different options and the strategies at play with the vendors that are providing platforms to service developer need out in the market. And then also on the right-hand side of the slide, really contrasting that with direct feedback from cloud developers themselves in terms of not just their experience with the different platforms they're using, but also how they arrived at the different technologies that were selected, who was involved in those decisions, because again, I think what we're seeing is already a shift in terms of how development is done in the cloud, but that as their use becomes much more mature going forward, we're really projecting and drew from those conversations to see how things are going to change in terms of how platforms are selected and used going forward, because we do expect to see quite an evolution at play over the next 3 years as the use of the different platforms matures. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jillian Mirandi to go into more detail in terms of both the platforms as well as the developer experience in terms of that overall ecosystem.
Thanks, Allan. This first slide depicts the public cloud market by the different segments. You see in 2018 the market will be about $112 billion. Now the smallest segment is PaaS, but we think that that is such a critical aspect. We've devoted a lot of a lot of this report to the past business models, what developers are thinking, and how vendors are reacting, because all of the vendors are really looking to get into that platform market to essentially become the underlying platform on which to run a business. Now, SaaS is the biggest segment. We think it will remain the biggest segment. There's a lot of new applications here to help with new business processes, or different business processes, I should say. There are many vendors here, and we think the number of vendors will remain pretty broad. You'll always have your large vendors, Microsoft, Salesforce, but there will continue to be quite a big number of niche players. The next biggest market is infrastructure as a service. Now, this is essential for computing, archiving, backup, running applications. Now, the vendors here, there was a consolidation a few years ago in 2012 and 13. A lot of the telcos, a lot of the traditional players were buying up cloud and data center players. We've seen this slowly continuing over this year and last year, but we think another big roll-up will happen, as well as some divestitures. In the end, we think a small number of vendors will really own this market. And lastly, platform. Now, this is critical for both the SaaS and infrastructure vendor success. We think the vendors will consolidate here too, and that a few of the larger players will win out. In cloud, the more broad vendors will win. So there's not really a clear path today to adopting public cloud. Many people come in from the productivity and the SaaS side. Many come from the infrastructure, the AWS side, which means vendors offering a number of solutions across the categories will really have the best chance of success with that platform tying it all together. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into the platform market, we consider this market to be made up of the test and development tools, some of the capacity to run these tests, as well as app stores. So again, this will remain a smaller layer, but in my opinion, the most critical layer of the cloud market. It's increasingly important to port applications across different environments. So successful past vendors will have robust ecosystems, they'll support Docker, and they'll be relevant among many cloud discussions. In the past, this segment, it's really been the sticky layer for vendors, especially vendors with APIs such as Amazon. Once you build an application there, you more or less are stuck to that platform. That's really changing. So the platform layer is no longer quite as sticky because portability is becoming so important. So that, again, Docker is there, different container companies. You have open source and opening the code in general. This, again, is a different depiction of the past market, and this time it's both public and private. It shows how quickly the market is consolidating. So by 2020, these graphs kind of flip to have the few vendors shown owning roughly 2/3, 3/4 of the market. The incumbents are Microsoft, Salesforce, Google. IBM has done a great job really catching up here. And these companies are all driving growth through continued service launches, so services around management, around APIs, automation. They're developing communities, so doing hackathons and meetups, pop-ups. There's even specialized communities such as IBM's recent launch of an IoT community for developers. And the reason they're doing this is because developers trust developers. While sales and marketing is important, having that grassroots movement to really convince developers and give them the tools they need, free access to your platform, is huge because they'll then build applications and talk about the platform to other developers. And lastly, ecosystems. So the broader the ecosystem, the more white space around both verticals and horizontal applications, as well as discovery of niche SIs or global SIs is critical to add different layers around the core applications. HP, which is showed here, HP, SAP, Oracle, right now they're all a very small piece of the pie, and it's mostly in private cloud platforms. My expectation is that over the next year or so, we'll see them start to differentiate in different areas, whether it be with SAP in-memory database, perhaps HP will wrap managed services around their platform. There's different ways to differentiate, and these vendors will need to do that, followed by developing a developer community to really become top of mind.
And the other thing to think about with this overall market share, both today and in the future, is that the ability to monetize this strategy goes well beyond just the market share that each of these vendors is able to realize in past. That, for instance, it depends on the vendor, but for instance, with Salesforce, the bigger that ecosystem is, the more development that's taking place on their platform, the more they're able to monetize through both their app store as well as the core CRM and other business offerings in terms of those actual subscriptions that they're able to sell. Likewise, with some with any platform provider, the development is one part. For a lot of these vendors, they're able to host the production applications that are developed once they're ready for distribution, and that there's additional cloud revenue and consulting around supporting that from a production environment, getting the capacity utilization for the production apps, and then both for their own services organization as well as partners, delivering managed services and consulting around those actual subscriptions are all ways that the pull-through and the influence revenue for these platforms is in actuality much bigger than just providing that platform as a service subscription.
So the developer visionary today is making the decisions. There are lots of platforms to choose from, most popular being AWS, Google, Microsoft, and IBM, again, doing a great job to catch up. And we see this shifting, though, over the next, really it's already begun to shift this year. We think by 2017, it'll be more of a group decision. So the developer visionary, if they're right now bringing platforms in themselves, executives are getting a little bit more involved. This has led to some more discussions about open standards, and you see Cloud Foundry and OpenStack becoming more popular in the last few months. LOB will have an influence, IT, of course, will have an influence, and then it will become a group decision. Now what this means is that sales and marketing of the platform will have to change. So you're no longer selling to just a developer, and we'll go over their traits on the next slide, but you have to have a much broader vision because more people are involved. This also means that buy-in will have to come from the top down because the cultural shift once you start using a cloud platform and cloud applications does change. It will remain critical to get buy-in from the developer community and that developer visionary, but it is becoming a much broader landscape. So who is the developer visionary? This is the developer evangelist or a thought leader inside of a larger organization, and it's usually an executive or the CEO of a smaller company, especially with the new born in the cloud companies. This person is not a developer or coder who executes on others' visions, but the one who really leads and makes the decisions. These people may or may not come from a developer background. I think it's safe to say the majority of them will have developer skills, but then there's also people like Steve Jobs who had the vision and could dictate what the developers did. Now here are some drivers and concerns among the different groups. And what's interesting is where these overlap. And initially I didn't really think These things would come out. I thought things like community and app store were more of a secondary requirement, but it comes to show that these are the most critical for the people between developers and executives. So again, that developer visionary. Some of the overlaps include community, familiarity with the platform. This means that a lot of people already have a skill set around that platform, so you can hire people very quickly. AWS has done great here. Almost all coders, all cloud coders are familiar with Amazon's platform. App stores, so this is more of a second tier for the larger companies, but definitely a top tier for the smaller ISVs who are replatforming on cloud platforms. Portability, vital. This is coming more from the executive point of view, total cost of ownership, and mobile capabilities. And what's interesting is that executives, they're more worried about the business, so they're the people who want open development, they want portability, they do not want to be locked into that one platform. Developers, on the other hand, they want to develop on a platform that makes it very easy and quick. So this leads them to wanting platforms with APIs. They don't really care if they're locked in. They just want to solve the problem as quickly as possible. And when it comes to IT, they're a bit more defensive about cloud. They're looking at security. They're looking at the risks more than the opportunities in some cases. And again, that is changing very rapidly. Now, as decision makers are more collaborative, vendors must appeal to all of these different parties. This is a depiction of today's developers. This study was done earlier this year, so I think it's already changing a bit. But the developers, they were looking at cost, ease of use, and scalability. Once you move to more of including the executives, these will start to change to add in the app stores and the communities and the portability. These are some of the barriers that we've found in the decision makers. So the biggest thing that came out here was that technology is not the problem. It's really the people inside the organizations. So the technology is moving faster than the cultures are ready for it. This means that the messaging, I think, needs to come from the top. We heard from almost all of the developers that the technology was in place. It was much improved, it was lower cost, but they were having trouble having the rest of the organization really understand and change their processes to adopt the new technology. And lastly, we see some market gaps. Management tools are a huge gap. Vendors are addressing this. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM, they've been adding management tools and capabilities. And we're also seeing this around the popping up of managed service providers, as well as adding managed services right into the cloud portfolios. Portability is another gap. It's a driver, but it's still, there's a long way to go. Open source frameworks, open source and code, and containers are addressing this gap. Support, we've seen a rise in managed services or built out support either internally or through partners, whether it's a global SI or a niche player. And lastly, messaging. And this is one area where the traditional vendors are really struggling. They're not saying how they're different, they're not saying where they're better. From looking inside, it just seems like the message is not very clear, and that's hurting them quite a lot among the developers. The developers are open to listening to these vendors and understanding how they're different, for what workloads or use cases they should use them, but today it's just not there. The next segment is about the competitive landscape, so we'll look at those vendors Allan mentioned. Here, the x-axis is portability, and the y-axis is usage or popularity. Now, this is a bit exaggerated to prove the point, but the upper left, Amazon, Azure, Google, these are the more highly popular but less portable vendors. They're already changing from supporting Docker, GitHub, adding communities. Google recently is supporting OpenStack. But by high and large, these are the more popular but less portable vendors. In the bottom right, we have lower adoption but higher portability because they're based on open source or support open frameworks. They too are trying to change to become more popular. They're driving usage with easier tools, communities, and a lot of messaging to the developer community. Now, both of these groups are really racing to that upper right, so high usage, high portability. And this is going to take more than just being an open source vendor. It's going to really take someone being a little bit different and the developers being very pleased and being able to build once, deploy on many platforms. To drive adoption, vendors can make the trials very easy, run small apps for free, so have that free tier, and get into developers' hands as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. Google's a good example here. They were an underdog and still are quite far behind AWS in terms of customers and revenue, but they're quickly getting into the developer community and evangelizing that community. They are getting developers, or another way to improve your developer community and attract developers is to get the developers talking about your past, so sharing code, sharing use cases. This could be among larger clients, such as ServiceNow has done with their Share program, or startups like AWS has done. To enable portability, we have a few recommendations. So expose APIs to make it easy and build, connect, and improve integration. Support trends like containerization, OEM companies like Apogee, support open standards because they'll drive longer-term adoption, especially as the enterprise moves to cloud platforms, and enable the application to be built once and then run on private cloud, public cloud, across vendors, and on-premise. Microsoft and IBM are doing a great job here. This slide shows who the vendors are targeting, from the startup community to the enterprise. So traditionally, Amazon, Google, Salesforce, they've been targeting the startup community. They're all trying to move upstream, and I think AWS and Salesforce or AWS for the most part is being quite successful there. IBM and Microsoft, more traditionally in the enterprise segment, they've done a great job marketing and getting startups involved as well as the enterprise. And then there's Pivotal, Canopy, and SAP, and these vendors are very enterprise focused. In this section, we'll talk about the different business models. So there are really three different types of business models around the platform. The first is charge for the capacity and tools are free. So this is traditionally infrastructure as a service. This is why you don't see AWS in the prior graphs. While AWS is a huge player in application development and deployment, they give their tools, their development tools away for free and just charge for the underlying capacity. So while they're in the space, how they charge for it in their business models puts them in the infrastructure as a service space. The next bubble, that more traditional PaaS bubble, this is where you charge for test and development and as well as production. So the production is built in. This is where you have a Salesforce.com, Google App Engine. It's a monthly subscription and it's much more predictable, if not a little bit more expensive than the infrastructure as a service route. Now the vendors like IBM and Microsoft who are addressing both enterprise and startup needs, they're also addressing various business models. So they have different, you can pay for what you use, you can pay for a subscription. We expect them to continue adjusting and expanding their business models so that they can attract and sustain growth there. I think all of the vendors eventually will have both models. At this point, Salesforce is probably the farthest away. They have one of the more expensive platforms. However, you can be a huge application running on Salesforce, and you're essentially getting that extra capacity for free. So we think even Salesforce eventually will start charging a little bit differently depending on the type of application. And last, we have the ecosystem. So this is the App Store, which is the platform on which to sell and distribute. This gives smaller ISVs and startups global distribution where they wouldn't have had it before. It helps to build in security, it aggregates the vendors, and it really allows the startups or the ISVs to add on to the application such as Force.com or an SAP application, as well as build net new standalone businesses. It's critical to grow these capabilities. They help with customization, they help fill gaps, and it really, these stores are needed to make the vendor remain relevant. This is a little deeper dive into the ecosystem, talking about the different types of businesses with AWS as the example. What we're seeing most recently is a big push around the niche SIs and the GSIs. Those Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, they all are partnering with large global SIs to help get them into the broader business transformation or digital transformation discussions. But within the niche SIs, we're actually seeing a lot of acquisitions here. Most recently being Salesforce acquired a French-based professional services firm around Salesforce, and CSC acquired Fruition, which was a managed services and an SI around ServiceNow. Here are some examples of a community. So AWS does a great job, and I just want to point out every developer we spoke to highlighted the community as being essential to AWS's success. IBM, Microsoft, others are building up their communities as well, and I think they can look to AWS as a good example of how to do this. Now this is more about the business model. So how are these companies making money? And we talked about a few slides ago the pay for usage, which is more of the infrastructure point of view, and then the monthly subscription. So you can see where the vendors here, how they're charging. The vendors in the middle having more of a mix. And then you have vendors like Google who has different segments of their business, but again, those are becoming more closely, work closely together as well. And this is the last slide. So this is how vendors can target different types of customers and different use cases. So the traditional vendors, again, they're struggling to break into this market without saying how they're better. For example, our customer service is better, our services are faster, we have higher SLAs. HP and IBM were pointed out by our developers as being having the bigger issues here. It had both to do with the messaging as well as the sales and marketing tactics. And HP and IBM aren't alone here. Many of the traditional vendors we're hearing these same struggles. So the sales team, they're used to selling bigger services. They don't really understand the platform. It's very hard to understand why they're different on the website. And the vendors like AWS and Google, while most people think they're heavily skewed towards online, they do have quite large inside sales teams, and their people are just coming at it from more of a place of help. They have customer support teams, so it's just a different way of selling that is a struggle for the traditional vendors, along with the struggles in messaging. Oracle, we've heard that they've had, the value prop is a little dated, so they want everyone to remain on the red stack. You can use Oracle infrastructure only if you use Oracle's platform and applications, so they remain very, very closed off. Amazon, they have a huge tool set to leverage. They have a free platform layer. They're always expanding and improving, and they have a large community of developers, which it's doing very well for them. So to look at this pyramid, the bottom level is the general development. So this is where you'll see Amazon, Google, Microsoft, And where I think the traditional vendors have a real opportunity is in this middle ground, as well as the top part of the pyramid. So the middle is differentiating in different areas. So I mentioned in-memory database, in mobile, in big data, in hybrid integration, in a professional services layer. So these are all different ways where you can build the platform to attract these types of developers, these types of use cases. The top layer is a bit tricky. So this layer is the applications vendors who are now platform vendors, such as Salesforce. SAP could go up there as well. To get vendors, or to get developers and businesses to buy into these platforms, they really need to buy into that application level. So there needs to be a good mix of related apps and standalone apps, but if you're going to build, the vast majority of Force.com developers, their applications are extensions or customizations of CRM or marketing or services cloud. So it's critical, and it's good and bad. It's critical because you don't have as many standalone businesses right now, but it's also very attractive to those developers because they have a huge cloud-ready customer base in which to sell. And with that, we are ready for questions.
All right, so we've had a couple of questions coming here. So let's begin. Are certain types of businesses moving to, excuse me, certain platforms?
Sure. We've seen a lot of startups moving towards AWS and Google. A lot of them are considering Azure as well. When you look at the enterprises, while AWS is in most enterprises, the executives are looking more towards the IBMs and the Pivotals because they're based on open source. Being based on open source allows them to know their application won't be stuck to a platform. Say if AWS disappears in 5 years, they don't want to have their application stuck to that platform. They would rather be able to move the applications onto different platforms. Thus, the open source is looking good for them.
Yep, and this is Allan. I think the other consideration that we're seeing more and more, particularly for enterprise development, is the flexibility of having different options in terms of public cloud delivery, private cloud delivery, connection to some of the on-prem development process and assets. All those things, as they look at different use cases for the development work, are differentiating some of the platforms where there's more flexibility in terms of how it's actually delivered and the attributes of the underlying infrastructure.
All right, next question. Back on the slide that had market share for public PaaS, can you speak to which companies are included in ROM?
Sure. In the rest of the market, you have SAP, Oracle, smaller companies like LongJump, Engine Yard, a few smaller players like Covisint. So there are some major vendors in here, but the market share is just so small we didn't want to include them in the bigger chart. I really just wanted to prove the point that the larger vendors were continuing to grow and eat up more market share. I think there's going to be some roll-up here, so companies like LongJump or an Engine Yard who growth has been slowing over the past few years. There's been some executive turnover in companies like Engine Yard. Oracle and AWS both invested in Engine Yard. So it's a lot of smaller players that I think will become acquired.
All right, we're just sorting through our questions here. All right, next question. Is there a formal TBR report that goes deeper into the drivers listed on chart 10?
Go back to chart 10. Yes, this is from the Cloud Developer and Platform Study.
All right.
And the red bubble here, this is the IT. So if you look at this slide, it has the developers or coders, the visionary, executive, and IT. The IT got cut off in the next slide, but that's their different drivers and concerns, and then the overlaps. So it still is those three personas, and then the mixture of developer and executive in that developer visionary segment, which is the green.
All right, next question. I would think that Salesforce is very enterprise focused as well. Slide 17. Any comments on that?
Sure. So Salesforce's their applications, so Sales Cloud, Services Cloud, Marketing Cloud, in the combination of these, those are very enterprise focused. If you look at their app store, however, it's mostly smaller companies to date. I think around half of the applications are free. You do get a license, a platform license, if you get any of the other clouds, so they are becoming more enterprise focused. I see the challenge with them going in the enterprise is that for LOBs, they are very likely to choose Salesforce. They're familiar with Salesforce. Their peers are likely, some of their peers are using Salesforce. When it comes to under the platform or the test and dev platform, the LOBs aren't really making that decision right now. They're going to have more influence, but that comes more from the developers and the IT people. So that being said, I think they're struggling a little bit to get in that test and dev enterprise platform space.
All right, next question. Do you have a sense of enterprise adoption of AWS for production workloads, or is it more dev/test?
I think revenue-wise, it's definitely more production. A lot of the businesses that are on AWS are very unique applications or entire businesses on AWS. So they would do test and dev in the beginning of it and then run it on AWS. I think because AWS is a little bit more closed than other vendors, it's harder to develop and test without using AWS for production.
All right, and I think we only have one last question here. I'm hearing trends of Platform 2 apps running in Platform 3, such as AWS. This is a lift and shift. Are you guys hearing the same?
I'm not sure what Platform 3 is, but we are, I mean, developers would like to be able to lift and shift. I think that's, again, why the open code is coming in so handy, running it, building an application once, and then being able to deploy it everywhere. That's good for the enterprise, but it's also really good for the startup developers, which I think we don't hear as much about. If you're a startup, of course you want to build your app once and have it run across different customers, whether they use AWS or Microsoft or IBM. You really want to be able to do that. So I think it is coming, but it's still in early days.
Cool. And actually, we got one last question that popped in here. Any industry-specific IoT platform on past vendors in the market?
So I think, so we're looking at, we are seeing more IoT functionality being built into some of the development environments. Microsoft, IBM, I think are two that stick out to me in terms of that specialized use case for development. But we really think that's at the early days, both in terms of what's available for IoT from the larger vendors and certainly from a development perspective. That will be something that we're going to be tracking the evolution of over probably the next 2 to 3 years in terms of the early stages of attracting an ecosystem, connecting data. We think data brokers are going to become a bigger part of that overall maturation of the Internet of Things development ecosystem in terms of allowing different application developers to tap sets of data that they can combine and leverage for analytics and Internet of Things functionality. So that's, we're tracking it. Certainly there's some marketing and initial offerings out there, but that's what we're seeing from the Internet of Things from a development perspective.
All right, so that's really all we have for questions. If we miss anything, we'll follow up with you guys later. And all right. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you Allan and Jill. You can follow the Analyst as well as TBR on the Twitter handles listed here. Additionally, please check out our YouTube page for our previously aired webinars, as well as our SlideShare account for our special reports and the slides from these previous webinars. Before we sign off, I'd like to take a very brief survey on the material presented today. We're always looking to improve both the material we present and how we get it to you. So we'll leave the chat function open for another minute or so. People will leave last-minute comments or questions. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and have a great afternoon.